Yeah, yeah. Good afternoon. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's talk. The Tocqueville program is and the Oslo workshop are co-sponsoring Stefan Kolev, who is currently a visiting fellow at Duke University, but he is a professor of political economy at the University of Applied Sciences in Zwickau in Germany, and he's deputy director of the Wilhelm Röpke Institute in Erfurt, Germany. Stefan's research interests include history of economics, constitution, political economy, Austrian economics, and economic sociology. His book, Neoliberal Conceptions of the State in Comparison, is forthcoming in a second edition in 2017. And today's subject will be Ordoliberalism and the Austrian School, two potentially complementary varieties of German language liberalism. Stefan will speak for about 40-45 minutes, and then he will take questions and answers. So he will take both questions and both answers. So please join me in welcoming Stefan to Bloom.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here for a couple of reasons. One reason is this pin. I seldom have pins, but this is the George Mason pin of Lynn Ostrom. And I'm really honored to be here. Let me show you why. So this is one of the most beautiful pictures of economists I've ever seen, and I'm very much in love with pictures of economists. So these are not just two giants of political economy, but these are, to my knowledge, the two giants of political economy, if we include Vincent Ostrom, in the recent decades in the US, who had the most serious interest in ordoliberalism. And I was privileged to talk to Jim Buchanan quite a few times about that. Unfortunately, I didn't meet neither Lynn nor Vincent, but through the writings of Pete Böttke, Paul Ligica, and most recently Vlad Tarko, I know of the serious interests the Ostroms had in ordoliberalism, and so Aurelian and I picked the topic because hopefully it's interesting, but also because it fits the genius loci of this house. This is something which I also really like. This is Germany's most important newspaper, Frankfurter Allgemeine, which in 2013 started a long series about economists called The Improvers of the World. And I like the picture because we have Eucken here, about whom we will talk today. We have Hayek here. For some reason, we have Ben Bernanke. We have Lynn Ostrom as the first portrait. And I contributed a piece on that on somebody else, but I think it was wonderful that they started the series with this collection of portrayals. John Robinson is also there. I don't know why, but okay. So it's wonderful. What I would like to tell you today, and it's of course quite an ambitious enterprise in 40 minutes. I would like to call it a tale of two cities. I took these pictures because they look comparable, even though the cities, of course, are not that comparable. Freiburg is a small place, and Vienna is huge. But this is Freiburg in 1900, and this is Vienna in 1900. And I would like to draw some comparisons, some lines of similarities and differences, of course, between the two. And it's a story of two cities and of four thinkers. These are the four I would like to focus upon, even though, as you will see in a minute, I would draw the focus even a bit more narrow. We have on the left-hand side the two ordoliberals I would like to focus on, and here the two Austrians, even though I have put Hayek in the middle, because, as you will see, he's a very interesting in-between between the typical reading of the Austrian school and ordoliberalism. As you can see, so Aurelian said I should not presuppose any knowledge on your part, so if I bore you with some details you already know, please excuse that. You can see that they broadly belong to the same generation, and that's why I think they're interesting, because I don't like that much the concept of schools in history of economics. It can be misused for a couple of reasons. So I would like to talk about people, and these people are interesting because they were in a conversation for decades. And that makes them interesting because they were living persons. I have a recent paper, the Duke working paper series, how misguided their conversations were at some points because of personal issues. But they had really interesting scholarly debates for a long time, That's why I think they're a subset of these two schools, which is particularly fruitful for some analysis. They knew each other, they met, even though it was super expensive to travel. These are famous pictures from the founding meeting of the Non-Tolerant Society in 1947. You can see the pointer. Yes, I do. This is Hayek moderating, this is Eucken and Mises sitting next to each other. As you can see, they don't look particularly happy that they're sitting next to each other. This is Wilhelm Röpke, and quite a few of other important economists. Milton Friedman is somewhere here. Quite an interesting meeting. And as you can see here, they were talking, sometimes not talking to each other, but interesting people. This is from the University Museum in Freiburg, and you can see that, and I said that Hayek plays an interesting role in this talk. You can see that in the University Museum, they have put all kinds of Freiburg School people. So that's Walter Eucken, we saw him already. This is Hans Böhm, and these are other important people. And they have put Hayek in between. Also, the books here are indistinguishable. So again, Hayek is not really either or one of the two schools, but he spent the last 30 years, with a small exception, in Freiburg. He has a famous book, which is not translated into English, called Freiburg Studies. So he's interesting, and since I have these time constraints, I will use him as a device to make things a little bit more compact. Jim Buchanan had a very nice quote, which Röpke, who's making these pins, has popularized recently in an unpublished paper. And basically he says that when we deal with all these schools, which can be, I think, can be termed in the phrase laissez-faire within rules, we shouldn't be too picky, and we shouldn't stress the differences too much. I mean, of course they all differ, and of course they have a different focus, and that's wonderful because it's a division of labor thing. So they contribute to different nuances, different ideas to this broad program of political economy and the laissez-faire within rules. But we can, I mean, Buchanan used the word marry them. I don't know if we should marry them, but we can stress the commonalities more than try to make them dichotomous and completely different. So that's what I'm going to do today. I will tell, of course, also the differences between people, but I would like to synthesize a nutshell of what I see was their common project. So I have a very simple structure. I have a historical context, or several historical contexts. I have a conceptual analysis, and then a brief conclusion of what it tells us for today. We cannot understand anybody in the history of economics without embedding him in his or her time, and that's what I would like to do. In the Austrian context, it's quite easy, or at least uncontroversial, that it all started with Menger in 1871, when he published his Principles of Economics. Okay. Other than that, the history is not easy, because there are lots of ramifications which came out of it, and it is a tradition which has been there for 150 years now, and of course it's not, it's anything but trivial, but the beginning is trivial. It's Menger, and Menger got it going. In the ordoliberal case, it's much more complicated. So ordoliberalism is a child of the 30s. As you can imagine, the 30s were the place and time in Germany where liberty had its all-time low, but it has really different roots. My current project at Eucken is focused on Weber, so currently I tend to overemphasize that a little bit also in the presentation today. But it has roots in the historical school, which I have put here, which Moller. It definitely has Weberian roots. And it also, when it comes to Eucken's epistemology, it has roots in Husserl. And it's a really interesting mixture of these and some other components. But then, and I put these arrows on purpose, not as long as the Austrian arrows, then it didn't last that long. So we had the Eucken generation, we had some students of them, and today it's in a sort of a decline. So I hope with talks like this and with some scholarly work which I'm doing that this decline might be stopped and reversed. We'll see. And I'm looking forward to discussing all this with you. Historical contexts, if we call them a generation, broadly speaking, they experienced the disintegration of the global economy post-1914. They, of course, were active participants, both the Germans and the Austrians, in the socialist calculation debates, which started in 1920 and went on basically until 1945 at least. I wrote here especially after 1920 because this was their part. There were actually also earlier debates about socialism in the 19th century. But concerning this generation, they were really quite active for about 25 years and made different contributions. And of course, they experienced the great failures of the historical school, which was the inability of the historical school to explain and help neither with the German hyperinflation nor with the Great Depression. So these were basically the ruins of the historical school out of which Ordoliberalism came out. And the Austrian school was always there, right? It was, as business schools would call it today, a sort of a co-petition. So they competed but also cooperated, and that's what should become clear in a minute. Of course, then they experienced all kinds of extremisms which came up in Central Europe, which were quite existential. So Röpke, I will tell about the biographies very briefly in a minute. So some of them were really threatened by all that in very existential terms. Then there was this very interesting meeting in 1938, the Kolev Walter Lippmann in Paris, where, so literature says the term neoliberalism was coined. That's not quite correct. The term neoliberalism existed also already in the 19th century. But that's when neoliberalism was coined by this generation as a description for themselves, saying that, well, we want to think about what liberalism means in the 20th century. So quite an important meeting, and out of this important meeting, the Tolerant Society post-1947 came out after the war. And what is interesting is that in the 30s, they were, for good reasons obviously, quite pessimistic about the spirits and about the fate of the civilization they were living in. And after the war, they were grabbed by a new optimism. In the case of Röpke, it didn't last that long. He slipped back into pessimism in the 50s. But around the German economic miracle, immediately after the war and in the early 50s, there was really a spirit, also for Hayek, not so much for Mises, that there is now a chance for liberalism to prove that given the imploded order of Germany, that something new can be set up. So as you can see, and these are not the whole lifespans, they lived through different countries, they lived through different cultures, they lived through different moments of time. So when I pinpoint now specific parts of their political economy, it will not be the whole structures, but rather what I would like to focus on. Very briefly about their lives. Eucken was born in the family of literature Nobel Prize winner Rudolf Eucken, an important philosopher. He was raised as a historicist, so he clearly had a historicist education. Then he came in 1927 to Freiburg and founded there with some law professors the Freiburg School, which was a really interesting collection of law and economics specialists. And this is the real core of ordoliberalism. So people say ordoliberalism is the Freiburg School. That's not quite correct. But the Freiburg School was the core of ordoliberalism, and then there were some satellites around that core. And an important satellite was Röpke, also his friend Alexander Rustow, and some other people. Röpke, as you can see, was a bit younger. That's why he didn't only have a historicist education, but also was an important theorist. Around the Great Depression, he made important contributions within the Austrian business cycle theory, saying that, well, in the early 1930s, we should expect that, we should let the boom of the 1920s purify, but that at some point we should be careful because the political structure is basically collapsing. So he said when the secondary depression sets in, we should perhaps start to push the economy because otherwise the political order will collapse, which is an important beginning of this thinking in interdependent orders, which you will see in a minute. Hayek, the in-between, same generation, same year as Röpke, had the longest life and also the most colorful life in the sense that basically he united all four centers of neoliberalism as they are described in literature. Born in Vienna, moved to London, moved to Chicago, and then in the early 60s came to Freiburg. So basically uniting all these groups of people, and of course a very important person, both as a thinker and as an organizer of the Montpellier Society and of other contexts. Mises lived almost equally long and was to that group a bit of an outlier. He was also not quite easy to communicate with, but quite important for them because being quite a bit of their senior, he rescued them of their socialist predispositions in the early 1920s, was always a sort of a mentor, but always somebody they were internally fighting with, and very important for the American revival of Austrian economics post-World War II. So he had to emigrate in 1940 under really existentially dangerous conditions from Geneva, where he was, to the US, and then at NYU found it really important outlets of Austrian economics. There until today, and even more so at George Mason. Okay, so now we broadly know who they were, we broadly know the time and the contexts they were living. So I would like to now draw some conceptual picture of how I read their political economies. So when I was at NYU in October, I was accused by a fan of Mises that I'm comparing, he didn't say apples and bananas, he said apples and pears or something like that, in the sense that it might not be quite comparable. As I said in the beginning here, I don't talk about schools, because schools are never comparable. I talk about people and their ideas, but it's important to make some caveats. So Vienna was different from Freiburg in the sense that it was the imperial university. Freiburg was a provincial university in the southwest of Germany, even though before the Austrian School / the Freiburg School came into being, neither of them were important in terms of the social sciences. They only became important by these schools. The Austrian tradition started much longer ago than Freiburg, that's clearly true. The Austrians were blessed with long lives, unlike the ordoliberals you saw, that's also true. I don't quite agree that the Austrians were specialists in high theory, whereas ordoliberalism is more applied, but there might be something about that. What is undeniably true is that the Austrian program has really not just survived these 150 years as an artifact of history of economics, but as an ongoing, very vivid program in the US and beyond today. Whereas ordoliberalism had this great generation, and afterwards there was a steady decline, and until today, we were talking yesterday about that. Germany doesn't really appreciate that tradition too much. I mean, on ceremonial occasions, the chancellor comes to Freiburg and celebrates Eucken, or the federal president comes to Freiburg and celebrates the Eucken Institute, but in the scholarly community, it's not that vivid anymore. It might be actually more vivid in the legal tradition and in the legal scholarship in today's Germany than in today's economics, which is very much the American type of economics. So this distinction is important, and that's why I'm really happy and grateful that in the US there are these spots like George Mason, Bloomington, who take interest in ordoliberalism, because I do believe that it is an interesting complement. That's also the title of the presentation, to some ideas of the Austrians. This is a very simple way to put it, but we discussed that I should put it here in simple terms. I do believe that the Austrian approach has a comparative advantage in explaining market dynamics much better than the ordoliberals. The ordoliberals were captured in something which comes close to neoclassical market form analysis, and Vincent Ostrom has many references to a critique of that, calling that model Platonism. And that's true. So this is really a clear advantage for the Austrians. They had a much more, and still today have a much more dynamic, much more sophisticated analysis of the market process, of the entrepreneurial activities, of the knowledge development process of the market. But I do think that the ordoliberals, by the way, also constitutional political economy as developed by Jim Buchanan, might have an important additional role stressing how these market dynamics are embedded in societal statics. And And that is important. I will try to make that point more explicit in the next slides. So this is basically this very basic complementarity which I see between the two. As I said in the beginning, currently I'm fascinated by Max Weber for a couple of reasons, and I think both are Weberian in the sense that both want to understand order. I will say in a couple of minutes what I mean by order. But the basic commonality is also that they first want to understand it in scholarly terms. And then, of course, it's the task of political economy is not just to understand, but also to shape it, right? To make the world a better place, as you saw in the newspaper article. And in that case, I would say on a very abstract level, despite all the differences in epistemological, methodological perspectives, they have this basic commonality, because that's their core goal, to understand orders and then to make them work better, given the understanding which has been gained. What is order? Okay. This is a complicated issue. I read a fascinating book by a German political scientist, Andreas Anter, and he shows on 250 pages that order is one of the most complicated terms which ever existed in human history, that many people have tried to define it, that most people have dramatically failed to define it by basically saying tautological things, that an order is a system, or an order is a set of rules, but rules are orders. So in a way, basically, not saying what it is. I cannot go much beyond that because I'm not Kant or whoever, but I can tell you how the Austrians and the Ordoliberals tended to understand it. They were not very explicit, unfortunately, but that's how I think they can be understood. Both Menger's book and Eucken's book are called principles of. Menger's book is called Principles of Economics. Eucken's book is called Principles of Economic Policy. So it's quite a bit about principles. So basically the role of the economist of that sort is to understand the underlying principles of this economy embedded in the society. Out of these principles, he has to derive rules, and that is really the core of all these pins, Ostrom, Buchanan, Hayek, Ordoliberals, that it's all about a rule-based approach to political economy, or even to, I would say, understanding society. So the rules have various functions, of course. We see the world in terms of rules, in the sense of high sensory order, and we should try, given our understanding based on rules, also to shape the world based on orders. So we should not just play around. There is quite a bothersome metaphor which has become quite common in very recent months among economists, the economist as a tinker, or as somebody who plays around and tries to fix the system, as a plumber. That's not the way these people solve the economy. They solve the economy as a very complex order of which we can understand only the basic principles. And that's why we should not play around, we should not draw and try to fix some tiny issues, because probably we will generate unintended consequences of great magnitude. Instead, we should try to shape this order by rule-based policy. So basically, this is the policy response of Eucken, this famous word Ordnungspolitik, which is non-translatable in any language I'm capable to speak, neither in English nor into Bulgarian. Clumsy translation is order-based policy or rule-based policy. So basically, we should address the issues of the economy, also of society, but let's focus on the economy in rules. So we should try to think what are the best rules for fiscal policy. We should try to think the best rules for monetary policy. We should try to think what are the best rules to ensure some basic security in society. But it should all be based on rules, in a way a Kantian way to think about that. It's not about interventions. They all, as you can see later on, try to develop an alternative to interventionism, saying that, well, we realize that the state has a role, but this role is not to play around. The role is to set up a framework, and within the framework, people will be free to cooperate and to set up a free society. So the role is to derive these sets of rules, which are, at a point of time, of course, we learn, and in the course of time we should learn what better rules might be, but we should set up the framework in such a way that the peaceful cooperation of people works as good as possible. So that's the role. The role is not to educate people in the sense that we are paternalists. The role is not to intervene in the market process, but the role is to set up the framework. And this is an ongoing program, right? It's not, nobody says that Eucken had the principles which are perfect, or Menger, or Hayek, or whoever. But I think it's an interesting meta perspective of how these things should be handled. Two wonderful books. I think the best expositions of this approach are Eucken's Principles, unfortunately never fully translated into English, but there is now an ongoing, or actually there is a beginning project of the collected works of Eucken, and I hope that in the course of that project there will also be an English translation, because the only book which has been translated by Eucken is his theory/methodology book of 1940, which is important to read, but I think the principles are much more important to understand his approach to political economy. And of course, Hayek's Constitution of Liberty is a book which is, in my reading, and I've tried to show that in a couple of publications, very close to that. So the Constitution of Liberty, in my view, is a book which tries to apply the principle of the rule of law to all kinds of, basically to this view on the economy and society I'm talking about. So I think these are wonderful books. They don't say everything, as I said. There are quite a few of issues which we should think about today, and people like Buchanan or, of course, the Ostroms and others have contributed to that. But it lays a very, very elegant and sophisticated framework that we can think about. So this here I call the pyramid of implicit division of labor. So the division of labor, and I have a picture on the next slide, basically says the Austrians are wonderful in explaining the moves of the game. So the economic process as functioning of the market. Eucken and the Freiburg School, so Eucken and the law professors I was briefly talking about, are very good at explaining the formal institutions, so the legal framework or the order framework, which are the formal rules of the game. And Röpke, his friend Husto, and the social market economy, which is based on ordoliberalism but goes a bit beyond, we can discuss that in the discussion if you're interested, has its comparative advantage in explaining the informal institutions. Röpke has this famous book, Humane Economy, where he is trying to set up an understanding of what is really the mindset which is behind these rules. So you cannot impose the rules. We know that from Romania, Bulgaria, and other countries after 1989. You cannot impose rules if people have a mindset which is incompatible to them. You cannot fight corruption in Bulgaria and Romania if people think that corruption is okay, right? So there has to be a compatibility between the ethics of liberty, as it might be called, and the formal rules. Otherwise, the formal rules are just on paper and wouldn't really matter in daily life. So that's why I would call this a pyramid, or if you prefer this picture, sort of a concentric circles, saying that we have the economic process, we have the legal framework, and we have the informal, even broader framework. And I think there was this implicit division of labor. I don't say that they decided they should specialize, but they, in a way, they had this different focus. And I think if you read them like that, it adds up to quite an interesting structure, where you have these different approaches and they tell you different things, but they are compatible. So it's now 10 years that I started doing that, and I don't always say that it's all compatible, and sometimes I really see clashes, but there are basic compatibilities. I can claim that. I'm happy if you challenge that, of course, in the discussion. So, some differences. The difference is that their systems of all the four people I'm talking about were differently grounded. I speak about, I use a word, Greek word, the topos, meaning the central place of their system. And the central place is different. So we have Hayek, whose entire system from the early 1930s onwards is focused on knowledge. Economics and the discovery of knowledge, the use of knowledge in society, famous papers of his. Then the Constitution of Liberty is a constitution of how to set up framework which enables the best processing of knowledge in the economy and society. So it's all about knowledge. His late work on cultural evolution is basically how the rules in the Western civilization have been an accumulation, more or less, in the course of time, of knowledge. So basically, the market being something like the processor in our machine, processing the knowledge, and the rules being something like the memory in our machines, which in the course of time accumulate or distill the knowledge of how society works or how it doesn't work. I mean, Bulgaria and Romania and the Soviet Union are good examples of how things don't work. The system of the ordoliberals, and I've always wondered why, is based on power. An obvious reason why it's based on power is, of course, that they lived in a time in the 1930s and 40s, and especially in that time, in the case of Eucken, which, of course, was the highest concentration of power in both in the economy, by the way, in the Nazi economy, and of course in the Nazi state, which is imaginable. So that's an obvious reason why we should talk about power. Even though, by the way, it was not quite safe to talk about power. So they were, in the late years of the war, they were quite in danger because they were doing some intellectual resistance, which became dangerous in 1944. But I think there are deeper reasons why they thought about power. One reason is that power also was important in the historical school. But I think, and that's what I'm promising right now in a different project, but it will have some implications also here, is because power was super important in Weber. We all know that the big book which came out around his death and in the years after his death is called Economy and Society. But the real title which he had envisioned a couple of years before was not Economy and Society, that was a meta title. The real title was The Economy and the Society of Orders and Powers, which basically means that the economy is one order, there are other societal orders, and all this is a system of interdependent orders. Within each system we have power relations, and we have power relations among the systems. So that's the Weberian project, and he passed away too early to make it full-fledged. But that's what he has envisioned, and that's how people read his economic sociology. That's what he went for. And I would claim that the ordoliberals tried something very similar. To them and to the Austrians, the economy was embedded in these other societal systems, meaning the law, the state, culture in a broad sense, if you want also language. So we have all these different academia, of course, religion, the churches. We have all these different orders, they all have their own logic. The logics are specific, but the system is interdependent. So we cannot just talk about the economy, or we cannot just talk about the law, or we cannot just talk about religion. We should specialize, we should have specific knowledge, but then we should be also able to have interfaces to this other system, because otherwise we don't understand the links. And if there is a shock to the system, like a war or Donald Trump or whatever, we only understand one subsystem, but not really how the whole system can or cannot absorb the shock. Okay. In my dissertation, the book which Aurelian quoted in the beginning, I tried to get some metaphors for how these people understood the state. Some of them are not particularly original. I mean, we all know that Mises himself said that he likes the night watchman metaphor. That was actually a caricature of a German socialist in the 19th century about liberalism, but he liked it. He said, yeah, that's how I understand the state. The state should just ensure property rights, ensure that nobody's killed. Other than that, it's up to the economy and to society to self-organize. The first one is also not particularly original. Ordoliberals, as I said, focus on rules, and then the state should be an impartial judge who implements these rules and doesn't interfere, as I said, into the moves of the game, but only focuses on the rules of the game. It's of course quite difficult to say how this should work out, and these are the discussions. And this how I think you can see how, for example, public choice challenged that and said, well, but the state is not impartial. It consists of all kinds of politicians and bureaucrats, and they're anything but impartial. So, okay, but that's challenging, and I think the progress of political economy, and as of any science, lives out of challenges. I'm happy about this one here. It's not my invention. Hayek uses the metaphor of the gardener, but quite seldom. And I added that the state in his system is a gardener of an English garden. That's something which I claim to be my add-on. So the English garden as opposed to the French, sorry about that, we are in the Tocqueville room, but so the English garden, as you know, is, of course it has patterns, of course, and that's what also Hayek says in another context. It's about cultivation, but not about control. So it's about cultivation of these general rules, but it's not about, unlike in the French garden, it's not about controlling the individual plant. So once you have set up the patterns or this general rule framework, within the framework, the plants should be spontaneously developing. So the state is a gardener who takes care of these general patterns. Other than that, it's up to the plants to grow or not to grow, to interact with each other, to cross-fertilize or whatever. Röpke also uses this metaphor of the rules of the game, but actually he has a bit of a different focus. So he says, yes, we have the rules of the game and they have to be set up, quite clear. But we have the playing field. And he says, well, and I briefly spoke about that in the informal rules categories. He said, okay, but the playing field can collapse, right? We were not served, say in 1930, we were not served well by the fact that the Weimar Republic had decent formal rules, because in 1933 it stopped existing. So what is it that ensures that the pillars upon this playing field, the pillars on which this playing field is built, do not collapse? And that's why I call it in English a stress analyst, in the sense of that person who basically takes care that a building is so constructed that it doesn't twist to the one side or to the other. And basically, he says that the state, but not just the state. Röpke has first of all, he's very close to a polycentric view of the state. So he's in love with small is beautiful in the sense of small units, and democracy as only feasible on a small scale. Second, he always stresses that the stress analyst is not just the state, it's the state in combination with all kinds of players in civic society. So the state is important, but since a local democracy, the state and the other citizens are in an almost indistinguishable relation, it's the state and these other players, being the press, the universities, the church, the intellectuals, all of them have this job of the stress analyst, so that the civilization, the playing field, doesn't collapse yet again. Okay, that's good timing. I'm coming to the end. So what are the lessons for today? This is something which I on purpose left fairly short so that we can discuss that. I hope that I provided some food for thought so that we can interact about that. There is a wonderful book by a friend of mine, Erwin Decker. It came out in Cambridge last year. And Erwin is talking about the Viennese students of civilization, meaning the Austrian school, but also making some references to the Ordoliberals. And I think this is a wonderful metaphor to describe the role which I also try to portray here. This understanding of orders, meaning the student. I also tell my students that I'm in my 37th semester now, so I'm an ongoing student of economics or political economy. So that's what these people were trying to do all their life. I got 93, and in the late 80s he revised some of his ideas about evolution, because he was an ongoing puzzler. He always tried to find some new answers, and as I said, the ordoliberals I was portraying were not blessed with that long lives, but also in their lifetime they changed opinions quite a few times. They changed their methodologies, and they also changed their ideas about policy. Actually, I don't envy people who don't change their mind. I think these are pretty boring thinkers who are not that challenging. So I think that's a wonderful metaphor, and it serves as well to say, well, what can we learn from such a type of economic/political economy for today? Well, I think today's economics, as taught at top schools like Duke or MIT or wherever, has lost touch with its customers. So all these people I described were also public intellectuals. They were heavily in Vienna, but also beyond Vienna, engaged in all kinds of intellectual discourses with political philosophers, with lawyers, with people like Freud, or psychologists, with medical scholars. It was always, that applies for Vienna and for Freiburg, by the way, in the 1930s. These were extremely inter- or transdisciplinary thinking people. Today's economists are not. Today's economists care about some applied math, whereas that's of course quite a generalization, but I think it applies to quite a few that, at least in Germany, we're losing students. Journalists often say that we cannot write anymore, which is true, because we write in English and, as I said, applied math rather than language. Neighboring social sciences are not in love with economics, as we know. And above all, and that's what I'm particularly worried about, I think in the eye of the normal citizen, economists are either frightening because they project some forecasts which never actually materialize, or irrelevant, or both, right? And I think this is really dangerous because, as Erwin shows, and as I hope also part of my scholarship shows, these economies which I try to portray today, their political economy, which in Germany until today is fairly widely known because they and their successors were quite active in writing for newspapers and popularizing all that. They were in touch with normal citizen, right? I don't say that that economists are philosopher kings and we know about everything, but I think we have to say something. We have something to say to society, and if we don't do that today, I think that's quite a problem. As I briefly mentioned in the talk, I think that our civilization is yet again under pressure. I don't just mean Donald Trump. I hope he's a short-lived experience, but living in Europe, seeing new extremisms, even in Germany, which I wouldn't have expected a couple of years ago, seeing the developments in Russia, seeing the developments in Turkey, which is close to my home country, Bulgaria, I'm more than worried. And so I really hope that economists would come back to talking to people. That's what we can do. We can tell people about mutual gains from trade. We can tell people that it's not a good idea to kill your neighbor because you cannot trade with him anymore. Things like that, right? Simple things. And above all, to say that we probably need better rules than the ones which we have. Every crisis shows that we have to improve upon the rules, but that within the rules, actually, we have achieved quite a wonderful world. Right now, being threatened to be lost again. Friends of mine and myself tried to underline that, of course, what I present here today is history of economics. I'm not, that's the book, I'm not only interested in these people as a historian. I love them in the sense of history, but we have to build upon that. So in this book, we try to show that this ordoliberal heritage can connect to quite a few programs. I mean, Buchanan and constitutional political economy is very obvious and has been worked upon, but also to law and economics, also to behavioral economics. So there are interfaces which can be explored by my generation and later generation. So it's not just about dead people and how smart they were, right? Okay, my conclusion. As I said, these people interacted over decades. They sometimes had productive conversations, sometimes very silly conversations, sometimes conversations which are helpful to understand. Also, there are misunderstandings. This is one. There are two versions of it. The one is that it was in Geneva in 47. The other that it was in Amsterdam 33 or in Rotterdam. Doesn't matter.
The moustache is unsettling.
Sorry about that. Yes, he was Viennese as the other one. So they were walking around, and this is a typical German slash Swiss small garden thing. And Mises said, what an inefficient way to produce vegetables. And Röpke smartly said, what an efficient way to produce happiness. Which of course is, okay, funny, but it shows that sometimes they were really talking beyond each other. Some more productive quotes. Hayek has famously, and George Mason had a huge wall saying that an economist who's only an economist cannot be a good economist, but actually quite a problem or a nuisance. To my knowledge, he said that for the first time about Röpke. That's a quote where he says, Röpke was among the first to understand that, and I think it relates to Röpke's incipient thinking in orders in the Great Recession or in the Great Depression, when he said that, well, the economic order needs time to adjust, but we don't have the time because our political system is collapsing, so we should interfere in the economic order, even though it's against the rules, because otherwise we won't have a political system in a couple of years out of which we can interfere, and that unfortunately proved prescient. And that's my last picture. This is something which Hayek said in 1947 in a meeting in the Alps, in Alpbach. It's a longer quote, but this is a part of it. He basically said that, as you can read, that thinking about interdependent orders as done by the Framework School, but also, of course, by himself in much more detail in the next decades, is the most important task which the human mind can pose upon itself. Might be a slight exaggeration. I mean, I don't think that's... but I think it applies to the human mind in the social sciences. I think it's a very fruitful approach to think about economy and society, and it's a fruitful approach, I think, upon which we and later generations can expand upon. It was wonderful to talk to you. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward now to the discussion with you. Thank you. I will leave the quote on the slide for people to reflect.
What I'd like to do is to take two questions at a time, so that we give us more chances to expand. So,
can you give me a piece of paper?
Yeah. So, please have any questions?
Don't be afraid.
Okay, so let's take Raphael and then Jordan, and then Frank.
So, thank you for a very interesting talk. From the little I know about ordoliberalism, I've picked up in recent years in terms of discussions of the EU and the kind of economic policies that people argue have been responsible for some of the fiscal crises of the EU. So I'm wondering what you think. So what's your evaluation of those critiques of ordoliberalism as an influence on the EU, and what this kind of debate about technocracy versus democracy that we've seen emerge over the last couple of years says about ordoliberalism?
Jordan?
So you mentioned economists being out of touch, and I'm curious, given the setting here at IU, if you have a feeling about how we should change the way we teach economics, if we should.
Yeah, we should.
By the way, Frank,
I'm going to toss mine also deals with the EU, and so it segues pretty well with Raphael's question. And, I mean, you say ordoliberalism is in decline. It's in decline as an intellectual field, but in practice, I would argue that it has been, continues to be the dominant practice in Germany, continues to be the architecture of the Eurozone, and it's also failed pretty badly, at least in the Eurozone. It's been pretty successful in Europe. And one of the reasons I see is that it works well when you have a relatively ethnically homogeneous group, and works less well when you have a less ethnically homogeneous group. And I'm just hoping you can elaborate a little bit upon the failures of the EU as you see it, and where where things need to go from now. Where there needs to be more of a rough approach, which is focusing on stress analysis and listening to the different economies that were incorporated into the European into the Eurozone.
I think I can take both questions as a combination. That's very challenging and very interesting, and of course super important. I mean, these were the questions I was hoping for. So basically, using that for current issues. Okay, so the European Union has indeed some ordoliberal origins. That's certainly true. I think it's a nice way to put it in the following picture. So ever since it all began in the early 50s, with the very early stages of European integration, you had two scenarios or two trajectories how the project could have developed. And I think we are oscillating between the two ever since. The one trajectory I call a large Switzerland. Large Switzerland means, if I may quote Tocqueville or refer to him, a very decentralized political order. So basically politics stays on the local level, meaning the nation states are below. And this is not integrated, right? Or at least only the bits and bytes which are absolutely necessary. What is to be integrated is the common market. So we have economic integration, whereas politics remains, as these people and others would say, on a subsidiary basis, meaning at the lowest possible level. So that's a trajectory, Europe as a large Switzerland. So political self-determination plus economic integration. The other trajectory is Europe as a large France. And that obviously means that we have a big capital and a centralized structure and a powerful bureaucracy which runs the country economically and politically. And in terms of economics, I think it's important to add that the large France would also be protectionist. So within itself, it's an open market, but then to the outer world, it might have protectionist tendencies. So I do believe that we have these two trajectories in the project. Until the 1980s, they were on an equal footing. Since the 1980s, unfortunately, we're going more and more into the larger France direction, since the two Jacques Delors commissions. But I agree that ordoliberalism in this very applied way matters to the European project. Why does it matter? So first of all, it matters in terms of competition policy. The competition policy of the EU clearly has these rules. And basically the German antitrust law of 1957-58 was at the basis of the EU competition law. Now, more tricky issues are fiscal and monetary policy, and these are the ones you referred to. Concerning monetary policy, of course, meanwhile, we know that when Germany unified, the French said, yes, you can unify, but without the Deutschmark, so that was the price to pay to not have the Deutschmark anymore and then to have the euro. And we've had the euro now for, say, 20 years or so, depending on how when you really take the real beginning.
It was EQ before euro,
yes,
right?
Yes. And before the EQ, it was these corridors. So it has a long history since the 70s. But if we say the euro, say since 99/2001, there were also different ideas how the framework of the euro would develop. The one idea was, and I always found it a bit naive, that the European Central Bank would become a large Bundesbank. This is, of course, naive because not just because the Bundesbank is one out of n countries in the European Central Bank's board, but it's also naive, and that refers to your question. It is naive because we have different cultures of monetary policy sitting in the same room. We have the Italian culture of monetary policy, we have the French culture, we have the Spanish culture, and they're anything but ordoliberal. And I don't mean it in normative terms. They're much more discretionary. So this division between an independent central bank, which has nothing to do with the fiscus, is alien to Italians, right? So it's a fiction to assume that the one representative, the Bundesbank, would dominate currently, I think, 18 or 19 countries there, and all of them would say, yes, we will take the rule-based approach. No, and that's what happens. I mean, the Bundesbank is systematically either in a minority of one or in a minority of 2 and 3 in this commission. So basically, we do have a clash of the rule-based approach versus more discretionary, more first things first approach, pragmatist, as some people call it. And this is a result of the different respect these cultures pay to the concept of rules, without any normative point in that. Concerning fiscal policy, Germany tried in 2011 and 12 to say, well, okay, we institute these new mechanisms like the ESM, but the price for that should be the fiscal compact, which was the attempt to take the originally Swiss debt brake, basically saying that you cannot do systematically deficits anymore, which was introduced in Germany in the late 2000s, and basically say, okay, we try over the European level to introduce it to the national levels of all EU countries. Formally it functioned, informally again, clash between formal and informal rules. It doesn't work. It doesn't work in France, it doesn't work in Spain, it doesn't work in Italy. So I don't want to really initiate a big Euro discussion because it's a bit off topic, but I think we can say that given these very different approaches to rules or pragmatism, if we call it like that, the Euro might be doomed unless we go into the real Great France direction and make political integration in the sense of a common finance minister, common taxation, but that would be, I think, the end of the European project, as I understand it, was as somebody like Röpke would understand it. So yeah, it's, but it is indeed about rules, and in what way you respect rules, in what way you let rules be valid even in tough times, or if you circumvent them when they are not comfortable. So I agree about that. Does it answer both questions, or will you? Okay. Okay, and about economics. Okay. So
just to preface your answer, is anyone here from the Department of Economics?
Thank you.
Okay.
Good that you're here.
Yeah. Well.
But it shows.
Yeah, focus is just taking classes there. But any faculty from the department? Any graduate students? Good for you, you are here, so thank you for coming. You are the representative of a missing department here, of a missing profession. So you have a great responsibility. Yeah.
Well, when you tell something about it, right? I mean, I don't want to be overly negative. I was more negative about my field until last year when I first went to the big economics conference in the US, which was last year in San Francisco and this year in Chicago. It's a huge conference with 12,000 participants. And ever since I've become a little bit more optimistic because the conference really shows huge diversity of approaches, huge diversity of non-mainstream fields which do exist, but unfortunately more in the US than in Europe. So the European landscape, or specifically the German landscape, is much more homogeneous than here. Here you have schools like George Mason, who, as Buchanan said, dare to be different, and I think with quite a success. So if I generalize and say the very standard economics which you are taught as an undergrad and even more so at graduate school, I do believe that it has to change. By that I don't mean that necessarily things have to be kicked out. So I do believe that the training which you get, say, if you do advanced micro, is really helpful for developing your logical skills. And I do believe that sophisticated knowledge of econometrics, we were talking about that yesterday, that studying the empirics was extremely important for the Austrians, and I think we should be knowledgeable of these methods. I think that we might not need econometrics 1 to 7 as courses, but I think this is important, both the logical skills which you get out of deductive sciences like micro and empirical skills which you get out of econometrics. About macro, I'm a little bit more skeptical, I have to say. But I think we need a couple of add-ons. So I've been teaching now for 5 years in my school and previously in other schools. And I experience all the time that, so my students are engineers and or business students. We don't have economics as a program. And I experience systematically that the models are not the really sexy way to get non-economic students into economics. And I think also the economic students today are not the ones I would like to have. What I would like to introduce, especially in the beginning of anybody's economic study, is a course in methodology / philosophy of science, or philosophy of social sciences, in order to understand what's going on here. So what is this? What is this economics? What are the boundaries of this economics? What are the methods applicable and non-applicable to that field? In what way is it different from the natural sciences? In what way isn't it perhaps not that different from the natural sciences? What does, in Weberian terms, understanding means as opposed to explaining? So, and I think this is feasible in the beginning of the studies. And I think it will be hugely motivating to the type of students I like who are interested in a broader, in the social sciences in a broader sense. And the second thing, which I obviously would like to introduce, but this is not rent-seeking, is history of economics. Okay, I'm biased. I would like to have a job teaching history of economics at a good school. But I really think that it can be super helpful because it would give you a sense that you're really in a fascinating field, that great intellectuals have contributed to that field, other than the authors of your micro textbooks, which are applied mathematicians at best, but not intellectuals. So it would actually make you proud of having selected that field. Or if you haven't specialized, I mean, in the US you have this much nicer system that you have majors and minors, and only in the course of time you really specialize. In Germany you have to specialize from the beginning, which is not that nice. But it would really attract students of a specific type, which we today lose to sociology, political science, law, philosophy. We would get them back, right? And in Germany, it's also a quantitative issue that we get less and less students, more students in the business schools and economics departments in Germany are mostly one. So there is also a transfer of resources away from economics to business, which is partially due to this quantitative impact that we lose students. And we lose students because the discipline is a bore. So I don't say that we should revolutionize it and kick it all out. That's not the way I want to be understood. But I think we need these attractions in the beginning so that you really become proud of what you study. Because otherwise it's very painful. I mean, what is your field?
English literature.
Okay, wonderful. But I mean, studying today's economics is painful. If you are not a great mathematical mind, and most economists are not, actually they're suffering collectively because they're failed physicists at best, mostly unpaid. So they're not great mathematicians, but they try to show mathematical sophistication. So it's painful, and this pain is not good, right? It should be pleasure.
It's like a colonoscopy without anesthesia.
Yes, for ears.
You got, Stefan, you got a question from Professor Anas Malik, who asked us to ask you this question.
He's watching.
He's watching, so thank you, Anas, for asking this question. What is the philosophical starting point for Röpke's ethics? Is Röpke using a metaphysics of natural law or covenant to position and explain the potentials for the informal institution underlying the ethics of liberty?
Okay, well, that's a very complicated question, and the problem with Röpke in this and other respects is that he was not very explicit. And another problem is that he was not very systematic. So if I, and I'm not an ethics specialist, so if I have to put him into a box, I would say that he was a virtue ethicist. So he was trying to explore Christianity mostly, but also other systems of virtues, and to show which of these virtues are important. The problem is that he set up large lists of them. So tolerance, but then you get terms like knighthood, knight, your favorite term, moderation, plays a central role. But it's a collection of virtues which he says that the free society needs so that it develops a humane economy. It's difficult for me to give a systematic answer, because I think he hasn't provided a systematic answer. He has a strong religious background himself, and I think it is reflected in his writings. And he's trying to show that without such, say, traditional, it also has a conservative twist, and that's why he was appealing to American conservatives. Without such a traditional education, without such traditional roots as given by a Christian/humanistic education, you become prone to all kinds of ideologies which are, of course, detrimental to liberty. And what is important, coming back to your question about economics, is that he always said that he distinguishes between economic and economistic. And economic is economics as understood properly, whereas economistic is an economist who is alien to any ethical standpoint, or basically where he says that he is, in Weberian terms, unmusical in terms of ethics. One more thing to say about that is his attitude towards value judgments, which is relevant here. He has an interesting piece called The Value Judgment on Value Judgments, where he says that, in very Weberian terms, as far as I can say, that yes, we have to be explicit as economists about our ethics, about our normative stance, if we're liberals or socialists or communists or whatever, but that being a student of civilization requires to take ethical positions, requires to make value judgment, requires to use criteria for judging orders. I mean, the ordoliberals in Freiburg were more concise on that. They said that we have two criteria to judge if a societal order is a good one in our sense. First, it should be productive, not surprising for economists. So it should be an order which deals properly with scarcity, which socialism obviously wasn't. And the second criterion is what we can translate as humane, or perhaps more operational. If this order enables a self-determined life. And if it does, so if it provides for enough liberty so that you can develop as a personality as you wish, then it's perfectly okay. So they were less, there is a word in German which is a bit difficult to translate, Moralinsauer. So Röpke sometimes read very moralistic, right? He shows what good society is for him. And the Freiburgians were not that explicit. They said, let's enable people to live their life as they wish, and if they keep the rules, these lives can be different and their understanding can be different. They don't have to have the economist as a preacher or as a priest telling them what good ethics is. Röpke had these inclinations, but again, he was not very systematic, and the origins are difficult to trace.
Other questions? Yes, please.
Yes, I'm very happy to say that I did not have a painful experience studying economics, because I was studying with a student of Walter Eucken
Who was
in
that?
Mainz, Hans Otto Lehmann.
Oh, he passed away recently, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And so I had a very interesting and stimulating studies of economics, which I still cherish. And after listening to you, I realized how much I've absorbed of that I didn't even realize comes from all these roots. And also I wanted to mention that Vincent Ostrom initiated the translation of Grundlagen der Wirtschaftspolitik, and there should be a copy floating around here somewhere in the workshop.
Oh, unofficial, so it wasn't published?
I don't think it was published, it was just translated because Vincent wanted to have a translation.
That would be wonderful.
So you should maybe ask Patty, she might know about that.
That's extremely precious.
Yes. And a question I have for you is how the rules, and I know they have been applied like in economic terms with monetary policy and so on, but how would a rule be applied, let's say, with environmental policy, with trying to curb pollution, or to actually outlaw the use of certain chemicals that are dangerous and things like that? So what would be an approach that ordoliberals would take to that?
So first, thank you for reminding me of Hans Otto Lehner. He was really, I never met him, but I know people who knew him well. He just passed away a couple of weeks ago.
Really?
And but at the age of, I think, 100 something.
He must have been really old.
Yeah, so he was a real student of Eucken in the sense that he did his PhD in 48, I think, under Eucken.
Before Eucken, right?
Yes, a real student of Eucken. There were later students of students, but he was from the very beginning the Schriftleiter, so the managing director of Ordo, which he...
Does that still exist?
Oh yes.
Ordo magazine?
It's not my computer, but yes, the Ordo... so it's the Ordo yearbook started in 48. Thank you for asking. It's an important issue. So the Ordo yearbook started in 48 at the same time, broadly speaking, when the Montpellier Society began. And Hans Otto Lehner was from then until the last Ordo, which came out in December, among the managing directors, editors. So the yearbook still exists. It was published by various the publishers, changed a couple of times. Now it has been, so the last publisher was now purchased by quite an important publisher in Germany, De Kuyter, which is very good because it's in all kinds of databases on US campuses. And also there has been quite a few younger colleagues who are now on the editorial board, so they try to introduce more English to attract more English contributions and or English language contributions. So yes, it still exists, and I hope that it will be part of this revival, that we get it, we make the Ordo Jahrbuch great again. Concerning your question about environmental policy, it's not my speciality in any sense, but let me try to answer that. I think we can think of different rules, and answering questions like that is, I think, also the way we should address these problems, because Eucken has a brief passage about externalities, but it's only a couple of lines. So let's try to think how the framework which I presented can help us. So one obvious rule can be we ban specific chemicals. You're right, you asked about chemicals. So, prohibitions are, of course, clear-cut rules. Not very efficient in economic terms, but sometimes useful and important for specific chemicals which we really don't want to have. And then, what I think might be quite a useful ordoliberal approach would be to say, well, we have all these emission auctions, right? And basically founding such a market as they exist in Europe for certificates for all kinds of emissions, and giving this market a framework, which of course is complicated in the beginning because we have to design the emission rights and to find the optimal number and to distribute it among the players. But I think such an auction with well-designed rules might be a good thing, because it gives the emissions a dynamic price. It's not a state. Pretense of knowledge to know what the right price for the emission of carbon dioxide is at a point of time. We don't know that. but the market can identify the prices. And I think the role of the economist, and that's what environmental economists do in Germany, is to think how these markets, not just for carbon emissions, but also for other emissions, can be given better rules so that the prices reflect the scarcities or the damages done by these emissions in an appropriate way. But I think that's, so either you ban, which, as I said, for certain toxic things might not be the worst thing to do, or you set up such an auction. The question, of course, is, should it be a national auction, should it be an EU auction, should it be a local? That's of course, goes beyond my expertise, but that might be a way how this can be addressed.
We have time for one more round of questions, so anyone wants to ask, I would welcome those now.
Okay. And this is just sort of building on the last one a little bit. What if we thought not just of the problem of the order of the economy, but the order of society more broadly, a la Weber, of which the economy is a big part, and then you as well, it's really the problem of, well, it's the knowledge problem plus the problem of collective action. Right? For whether you're talking about an environmental issue or a broader societal issue or a more narrowly economic issue.
That's one question. Anyone comments? Yes, please.
Kind of related. I was wondering what the two different schools might have, not in the diagnosis of failed states, but rather in maybe solutions to failed states or like developing countries.
Okay.
Okay. So anything else before we? Okay.
Okay. So the order of society. Well, I think this is. Let me portray that in a way which I think can contrast political fields. Although I can Hayek put these two. Hayek and Röpke. I think it's a nice way to also understand Röpke, because Hayek is broadly known. I think it's a nice way to contrast them in the following way. So if we say that there is the logic of the small group, logic of the community of people who know each other, and there is the logic of the great society, they had very, actually, opposite worries. The worry of Hayek, as widely known, was that the logic of the small community will always infringe upon the logic of the great society, so we will have all kinds of social justice problems and things like that. So his worry was, how do we preserve the logic of the great society, which consists of rules, and the logic of the small community doesn't infringe upon the rules. And Röpke's worry was the opposite. So the worry was, how do we keep the small communities and they don't get crashed by mass society? Word which is a bit complicated, but yeah, that's what he was worried by. So how do we keep these small units? Because in the small units we have functioning democracy, because in the small units we also have a type of an economy of independent people, so they are not part of mass production. So he was always quite worried about the big industry, the big units. And so that's what he was worried about. I mean, it sounds conservative. In the book which Aurelian is browsing right now, there is a word calling Röpke retro-utopist, because he was dreaming of a past which never existed.
Merry England.
Yeah. So I think there is something to that. I mean, it might have existed in some valleys in Switzerland, but other than that, perhaps not. But I think it's about today's world. I think it has a relevance. So we can, I think, if we take what I just said and apply that to the phenomena of globalization and digitalization, I think it can be matched quite nicely. I mean, obviously, globalization is a Hayekian process of the great society and of anonymity and exchange, and we don't know each other, but we trade. And we see that there is resentment to that in the US. Quite topical, right? So openness creates resentment. So the small unit tries to close the border because openness is dangerous. So we have that. But then we have digitalization. I think digitalization can be seen in Röpkean terms because of all these toys which we have around the desks, the small group has become feasible again, right? We had community, so I had lost so many Bulgarian friends which I have now rediscovered via Facebook and other social media, that because the transaction costs are so low, we rediscover old communities and set up new communities which wouldn't have been feasible 30 or 20 or 10 years ago, right? So there is a chance that we say, okay, we have the logic of the great society of globalization, we have the logic of the small community in digitalization, and it might be, that's my hope, that the small community relaxes because it can function in the digital sphere and lets globalization in peace. But that's of course a bit optimistic because we know that in the social media we have echo chambers and all that. Okay, but still I think it's important to notice that in his time retro-utopism might have been an appropriate term. In today's time I think we see a revival of the small units of that you are able to communicate with the ones you really want to. You're not compelled to just be to communicate with your physical neighbors. So I think in that respect, the order of society is changing, but we have these conflicting logics, and we have the potential conflicts of them, and I think they will accompany us for quite a while. I don't think that we are schizophrenic and that we can split them. We always have also internal conflicts about them. And that's why I think their division of labor was interesting, because they stress different things and they were debating that. So is it reconcilable or is it totally antagonistic? I think it's not antagonistic, but it creates tensions. That is certainly true. And technology changes that, obviously. About your question, failed states like Bulgaria. I mean, I've thought quite a lot about Bulgaria. It's not a failed state like Somalia, but Somalia with snow. Basically.
And roses.
And roses. Yes. Okay, what do they have to tell us something? I wanted to make an optimistic ending to what you just said. Let me try to say something now not too pessimistic. So, let me put it like that. A collapse of an order, like in Germany in 1945 or in Bulgaria in 1989, of course, is a huge opportunity. It creates a vacuum. But unfortunately, in the post-communist world, and I just take it as an example to answer your question, in the post-communist world, different than in Germany after the war, at least in degrees. Perhaps not in kind, but in degrees definitely. This vacuum was not a vacuum. So what survived, and that's, I think, not untypical for failed states, is that it looks failed, and it is failed, but if you know the country, and I know my country, and Aurelian knows his, there are quite a bit of power relations which you wouldn't see as a foreigner, but which you do know, which do exist. So there are patterns of order behind the veil to the foreigner. So if you're in a failed state and you're an insider, it might well be that you're confronted with extreme power relations, with extreme, let's say, with power structures in the type of clans or mafia or all kinds of things, which create their own order, which is perhaps efficient. Mafias tend to be efficient, but certainly not humane. And in that respect, I think that ordoliberalism is important for moments of transition, because it guides you to these power issues. It guides you to the issue that power is often invisible, but not non-existent. It guides you to the issue that informal networks can have very orderly results, even if you don't like them, right? So I think the Austrian approach, and I've written a bit about that, is more applicable to times of steadiness, of continuity, so that the market process can just unfold and creates the nice things it creates. Whereas the ordoliberal thing at least warns you about some rocks against which you can collide in terms of failed orders, failed states, and transition. So in that respect, I think it's really useful, and it had a sort of a revival in the early 90s because the students of Lehner, I don't know about himself, so they all flocked out to Russia, to Eastern Europe, and it was helpful because it really said that, well, you will need new rules, that's obvious. It's not difficult to get to these rules. I mean, here again you can see that the Central European countries like Poland, Czech Republic, were much more successful than our countries because they had, among other things, a respect for rules, which our region doesn't have. So in our region there is systematic clash between the formal rules, which are there now because of the European Union, and the informal disrespect for rules, which is omnipresent in our culture. So again, you see the power relations, and then the match or mismatch between formal and informal institutions is, I think, quite helpful to as a lens to take from them, which is not in the Austrians. As I said, the Austrians are wonderful for steady, peaceful times, which we hopefully will have. But as I said in the presentation, I'm quite worried about the times we're heading to. So thinking about stability and thinking about how statics can be preserved might be more topical today than, say, 10 years ago.
That only gives me hope that by bringing you here and allowing our students and colleagues to learn a little bit about these two schools, we can contribute at least to keeping alive the memory of those who, as you rightly put it, were students of civilization. So thank you for taking time to be with us. Thank you for...
Now we march on the economics department.